In 1817, the Napoleonic Wars were finally over, and when Britain's soldiers returned home, they found pretty much nothing waiting for them. Jobs were scarce, the food prices were up thanks to the Corn Laws, and the taxes had risen to cover the war debt.
The average labourer was earning barely enough to survive. Even bread was a luxury. There was no vote for the poor, no union rights to protect them, and no legal way to protest. So people began gathering in secret, and that growing unrest would soon ignite a rebellion.
Across the Midlands and the North, whispers were growing. People were meeting in secret and they were angry. England was teetering on the edge of something. And here in the village of Pentrich, there was about to be a full-blown revolution. At least, that's what they thought it would be.
A group of men began to meet in secret, fueled by the rumours of uprisings happening across England. There were farmers, miners, framework knitters, ordinary men who just wanted to earn an honest day's wage. And then a stranger came to stir things up, a well-dressed man calling himself William J. Oliver. He spoke to the men of revolution and told them men were rising up across the country to overturn the government.
But all of this was a lie. What the men didn't know was that William J. Oliver was a government spy. He was being paid to provoke a rebellion so that it could be crushed immediately. And everything that he heard and saw here in Pentrich went straight in his report to the Home Office.
In Pentrich and South Wingfield, men began to arm themselves. They were led by Jeremiah Brandreth, an unemployed framework knitter who was known as the Nottingham Captain. He gathered men such as stone-getter Isaac Ludlam and stonemason William Turner, all of them determined to bring about change.
On the night of June the 9th, the men gathered at Hunt's barn, armed with pikes and a few old muskets. Brandreth told his men that they would march to Nottingham, and from there they would march down to London, that thousands would be waiting, ready to join them and rise up with them. As they left the barn, the men split into two groups so that they could rally more men and more weapons.
Brandreth led his men here to Mary Hepworth's house, where he hoped to gain support and arms. When he arrived, he found all the doors and windows locked. Brandreth demanded to be let in. The servant, Robert Walters, went to the kitchen to put on his boots, just as a warning shot was fired through this window, killing Walters. This was the only fatality during the uprising. No one was charged with Walters' murder, as the men either didn't know who fired the shot or wouldn't say, but it was a grim foreshadowing of what was to come.
The men regrouped and they marched down from Pentrich to Butterley Ironworks, where they'd intended to seize more weapons. Here at the gatehouse, they were met by the foreman, George Goodwin, and he stood his ground. He told the men to come to their senses and go home.
George was joined by a few local constables, and the rebels failed to take the ironworks and any weapons. Possibly demoralised by this, some of the men decided desertion was a wise option, and they broke ranks.
Although they were now down in numbers, the men headed into Ripley and Codner, pressing more followers into service and waking up local publicans to provide them with beer, bread and cheese. By now, there were hundreds of insurgents.
There were numerous pub stops along the way, and if the men hadn't have been carrying weapons, it would probably have looked more like a giant pub crawl than an uprising. By this point, it was raining heavily, and not surprisingly, more men decided to call it a day and head home.
By early morning, they arrived in Eastwood, hoping to meet hundreds of others rising up, just as Oliver had promised. But there was no one, just silence.
When they were close to the village of Kimberley, the men spotted a large group of soldiers ahead and they turned and they fled in panic. The government had been tipped off by Oliver's reports and the uprising was over in less than 12 hours.
In the days after the failed rising, the manhunt began. Dozens of marchers were arrested. Some in their homes, others tried to hide in barns or hedgerows.
Jeremiah Brandreth, William Turner and Isaac Ludlam were among the first to be captured and the government was determined to make an example of them. They'd committed treason and the punishment for that at the time was death.
The trial began in October 1817 at the County Hall in Derby. William J. Oliver, the very man who helped stir the rising, was now its chief witness.
Brandreth, Ludlam and Turner were found guilty of high treason and for that there would be no mercy. They were publicly hung and then beheaded outside the Derby jail to make an example of them.
When Brandreth's head was shown to the crowd didn't cheer the death of a traitor, and many were disgusted by the verdicts and executions. It was the last time this punishment was ever carried out in Britain. The Duke of Devonshire ordered the demolition of around a third of the village of Pentrich, turning the families of the men who had taken part in the revolution out onto the streets.
The Dog Inn at Pentrich was here in 1817, and it's more than likely that some of the men that marched shared a pint here whilst making plans before setting out that night.
You can just imagine the men sat huddled around the fire, pint pot in hand, talking of revolution. This was England's last ever revolution, and it was quite possibly its shortest lived.